Welcome back to Beauty Marks Podcast, a space where we embrace our marks acquired through our journey. My name is Elizabeth Savillon, and welcome to another episode of this podcast. This is Women Empowerment Month, and I am bringing on and to share with you guys. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review if you haven't, and you can follow me at Elizabeth Savvy for more weekly content. So in this week's podcast episode, I have Simone Saunders, and she is a graduate and a registered social worker and therapist in Alberta. She is the founder of the Cognitive Corner, and that focuses on providing trauma-informative education. And she's really big on TikTok and social media and gives very practical tips when it comes to that. I'm excited to talk to her about trauma, how it affects our body, and how to regulate that within ourselves and the things that we experience. So let's just get right into it. To Beauty Marks Podcast, Simone.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for today's conversation.
Yeah. Can you share what got you passionate about the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of things. So number one, growing up, I knew family and friends who had really struggled with their mental health. And then I also have had mental health challenges throughout my life as well. And I know that when I was looking for a therapist, I found it really difficult to find someone who really looked like me or understood my experiences. And so it definitely made me want to go into the mental health field. And so I think that was kind of the catalyst that really struck me to say, like, okay, I do want to be a representative in my own community and provide that space that I was originally looking for.
Mm-hmm. Usually when we see someone that either looks like us or has experienced something, we connect better with that individual. So I completely agree with that. How has that affected your work with working with minority groups or people of color in mental health?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it was kind of the catalyst for me starting the practice in general. So the Cognitive Corner is mostly known for the social media platform, but it's also a group psychological practice in Calgary, Alberta. And so my intent with that was to have practitioners, regardless of race or anything like that, be culturally responsive. And so that clients can know that whichever therapist that they decide to go with has the ability to see their unique experiences for what they are and integrate them into their mental health care. So I think that it can be really difficult to find therapists or mental health practitioners that do really provide culturally responsive care, especially outside of your own kind of ethnic group sometimes. And so I think it's really important that there's kind of that representation in the community, because mental health field is kind of like a white dominated field, but at the same time for other practitioners, regardless of race, to be culturally responsive.
That's good. How has that looked like with now social media and like the boom of a lot of tips out there? Do you feel like people are more informed with mental health, or do you feel like there's still a really big stigma?
I definitely think that people are more informed. I think that there's still a stigma. I would say that I think that certain mental health conditions are less stigmatized than others now. So I think what is more quote unquote normalized is, depression, anxiety, experiencing trauma. But I think that the realities of what those experiences look like are still fairly stigmatized, and other mental health conditions like, bipolar disorder and psychosis and a lot of other ones, I think, are still very, very stigmatized.
Talk a lot about how our childhood has a lot to do with things that we experience as adults. And I've had a different mental health therapist and counselors talk about those things of how like our origins and the root of certain issues that we have, but sometimes we don't know how that even started. And so what are your thoughts on when it comes to our childhood, how they affect us as adults or can affect us?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is just relationships. So I think that the way that our childhood is often shapes how we navigate relationships because relationships are a massive part of our lives. And so if we have, for example, if we have great examples of relationships, if we have great experiences with relationships, if we are able to feel loved and cared for and validated, and really seen and heard in a lot of our relationships in childhood, then it makes it much more likely that we will experience those things in adulthood and be able to show up for people that way. But if what we see and what we experience is the opposite of that, or sometimes the opposite of that, then that can also impact the way that we show up in relationships and the way that we experience relationships as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that that also has to do with what we look for in relationships as adults?
Absolutely. I think that we often go for what we know and what's comfortable. And what we know and what's comfortable isn't always something that feels good. And so I think that that can be something that a lot of people have trouble with because we can sometimes find ourselves in relationships where we are consistently feeling invalidated, consistently feeling maybe used or belittled or whatever it might be. But it could be that those relationships just feel comfortable or normal because that's what you've experienced. And so we often push away things that feel uncomfortable. And what's uncomfortable might be people who are really validating, people who actually want to get to know you, people who appreciate you or do things for you.
Mm-hmm. When someone has experienced trauma, do you find that when it comes to because the term of regulating your nervous system has come up a lot with trauma, and how to switch from that fight or flight to an actual being calm and at ease.
Mm-hmm.
How have you seen that play out in people that have experienced trauma?
There's definitely a lot of hypervigilance around relationships. So whether it is, I don't think I can trust anybody, or I absolutely trust everybody. Mm-hmm. So I think the most helpful middle ground is that, I believe people are inherently good if they can be, if they have the skills to be. And I also think that, there are people that will hurt you. There are people who want to harm you. And so I think it's a balance between um, giving some people the benefit of the doubt and also being mindful of what behaviors you're seeing and how they're communicating with you and kind of not having those blindfolds on. And those blindfolds are kind of created by trauma a lot of the time. So learning how to regulate your nervous system and learning more about your body and how what it feels like when your nervous system is activated can be really helpful in kind of removing some of those blindfolds.
Mm-hmm. It's like what you were saying, what we know, it feels like home, but home can also be very unhealthy. And that in my own trauma work, that was a big realization that it was just because it feels comfortable and this is something that I'm used to, doesn't mean that it's healthy. And I never knew what healthy looked like, or how I realized my heart rate or the anxiety I felt within my body when I was around certain people or in a situation. But then knowing that what the opposite felt like, it was kind of the peace also felt wait, where's the drama? Where's it's you're kind of looking for it. And so I don't know if you have clients that you have experienced that with or yourself, but how do you first become aware that maybe you're kind of I wouldn't say addicted to the chaos, but it was that's something that's normal to you.
I think it starts with first examining your previous relationships, but also understanding, okay, have you had moments of kind of just stillness or moments of objective safety? And what does that feel like? So in those moments where you're not having those high highs and low lows, what does it feel like for you? Because it feels like it's dangerous, and that's something to be curious about, because those high highs and low lows are not necessarily indicative of passion like society and movies tell us it is. It's indicative of, a relationship that is really dysregulated.
And if someone has experienced trauma, maybe not in relationships, but just through childhood, or we were talking about, what are maybe some signs that they can feel in their body? Because a lot of us don't know what trauma feels like. I feel it's mostly how it looks like extremes of situations. So how would that look like?
Yeah, so nervous system dysregulation can look like a few things. So I usually talk about the window of tolerance when I'm talking about nervous system dysregulation. So we kind of have our window of tolerance, which is a framework that allows us to really understand our nervous system. So that window is where we can think and feel at the same time. So we can, experience normal stressors, but also be able to use our logical brain and use our coping mechanisms or deal with things in a way that doesn't feel like it's unsafe. Whereas when we're outside of our window of tolerance, we're either in hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So hyperarousal might feel like your heart's racing, you have really high anxiety, you're really angry, you feel out of control. Sometimes when people get really angry, they might feel like they're blacking out and they can't remember anything. Um, Impulsivity, that might be like impulsive spending, impulsive eating, gambling, addictions, suicidal ideation, self-harm, that typically all fits within that hyper arousal.
Mm.
Whereas hypoarousal is kind of your numb state. So that might look like dissociation, feeling frozen, feeling like you just don't have any energy, you can't get out of bed, all of those things. So those two kind of extremes, they some of the symptoms can sound extreme, but in reality, it can look like you standing there and your heart is just kind of beating out of your chest,
Mm.
and you're, internally having a lot of anxiety, or, you feel a certain way and then you notice, okay, now I'm at the mall and I've spent $500 that I don't have,
Mm.
or I felt a certain way and then I just picked up all of this food in order to eat and I'm just, numbing myself and I didn't even realize that I was eating as much as I did.
Mm.
Or the opposite, not eating at all because of your anxiety or your nervous system dysregulation.
Mm. So those are like, is it that someone gets triggered and then those are what they act upon?
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like um, a symptom necessarily of it's kind of your body's way to regulate itself. So with the impulsive spending, the food, the self-harm, the suicidal ideation, that's your body's way of trying to regulate itself out of that state.
Mm-hmm. And it's like to numb out, to not deal with whatever the real issue is or what you're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing. Have you ever
Mm-hmm.
read The Body Keeps the Score?
Mm-hmm. I have.
So that book, I feel like gave me a different way to see like how we process our trauma and things that we've experienced. And can be like, because I was the person that used to think extremes. Like if I didn't experience this, then I haven't gone through trauma. Or like, oh, because I
Mm-hmm.
went through this is what would categorize me. So it was like comparison of trauma, when we've all experienced certain situations that can be traumatic to us personally.
Mm-hmm.
And my biggest thing was on trying to figure out how that looked like in my life because I was never that self-aware to those things. So someone that
Mm-hmm.
maybe has not done trauma work and is not aware, what are the like practical things that, like, you gave some examples, but what are the things that maybe within themselves that they can see, that they can categorize as trauma, like, oh, maybe this is why, or like I've experienced this.
Yeah, I would maybe start with like your outlook on your relationships and your outlook on life. So, what are your kind of objective feelings and thoughts about people's intentions, the way that people are? And instead of thinking logically about what your intentions should be or your opinions of people should be, think about the way that you treat certain situations. So, when you think about the statement, most people are good at heart, is that something that you truly believe and is something that you find kind of aligns with the way that you move throughout the world? Or do you believe the opposite? When you look at your relationships, how do you feel in your relationships? Do you find that you are the person that everybody relies on, but you don't really get anything from your relationships? Do you find that a lot of your relationships are really codependent or maybe really emotionally distant? So I think that taking a look at relationships in general can be a really great way to understand kind of how you're navigating the world.
Mm. I what you said resonates a lot with people that I've heard that say that it's like I feel like I'm always giving and then I feel like I don't
Hmm.
receive, or they have very superficial relationships, but like the in-depth
Hmm.
part is like harder to navigate.
Hmm.
And what do you feel like stops people from like kind of, because doing the work is hard. So like the healing part is
Hmm.
really difficult. Like, so I feel like, do
Hmm.
you think, and I've gotten this question before, like, do you think it's just easier to like, not know about it because then you won't have to, like, you can just kind of continue doing the same thing,
Absolutely.
but then when you're healing or you're like aware of it and you're like, this, it takes so much work and this is very painful because you
Hmm.
start seeing things for
Hmm.
how things were. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because I know some people listening are like, yes, I know I have this stuff to unravel, but like I just feel like it's too much to work through.
Hmm. And I could totally understand that feeling. I think the it definitely is blissful ignorance before you even know
Yeah.
anything. Because I think about before I even did my own trauma work, I was living in blissful ignorance for a long time. It just my life felt completely fine. And I will say that now that I've been through a lot of the work, I would say that my fine or my happy was definitely um, more of a superficial layer of fine or happy because I wasn't experiencing my emotions really to the depth that I needed to. And so, in that, that means that if I'm not experiencing the more uncomfortable or difficult emotions to the depth that I need to, that also means that it impacts the more positive or feel good emotions as well.
Mm.
So, I think that it definitely is a normal experience to be nervous or scared about everything unraveling when you start doing some of that work. And I also think that um, it's really important to find a good fit in terms of like a therapist or mental health practitioner that you trust in order to start doing that work with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's kind of a misconception too about therapy sometimes that the minute that you start therapy, that's when you just, start unraveling everything. And I think that it's very much at your own pace. So if you have a therapist that is really a good fit for you, they should not at least kind of push you to go farther than you're ready at that moment. It's about meeting you where you're at. So wherever you're at and you're able to kind of make those steps, then I would say start small. It doesn't have to be you conquering everything within, a
Mm-hmm.
few months.
Yeah. Yeah, because we're like, okay, we start with the to-do list of all the things that I have to do, and it can feel like
Mm-hmm.
a lot. So I agree. My
Mm-hmm.
I tried, I had, I would say I was blessed with my first therapist. It ended up working out, and we have been together for a very long time, like our relationship.
Oh, amazing.
Um, but I know that that's not everybody's experience. And sometimes the first time that
Mm-hmm.
they go and they don't feel that connection or they feel like too pushed, they're like, you see,
Mm-hmm.
that's why therapy isn't for me. So
Mm-hmm.
what would you tell those people that are maybe like, yeah, I've tried that, but like it's hard to find someone to connect with?
It is. And I always compare it to dating. If you look at it like um, it's not an arranged marriage, right? So the first person that you get with, you don't have to necessarily stay with. So it
Mm-hmm.
can be just like dating where you try out different people, you go on consultations, all of that, ask questions, because just as much as, the therapist might be asking you questions about what's going on and the things that you're dealing with, you should be asking them questions as well to make sure they're a good fit for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to do the research around knowing what you want so that you can kind of find the best fit for yourself and knowing that if something doesn't work out, if you feel safe enough, you can talk to the therapist at that point if you've developed enough of a relationship to do so. But if it doesn't feel comfortable or safe to do so, then you can also find somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. I try to encourage my friends and people that contact me for that. I'm like, keep looking. And like, I mean, there's a lot of resources nowadays when it comes to online and maybe local or however someone can, it works best for them. So I love that.
Mm-hmm.
But I love how you said it's like dating. Yes, that's a great way to
Yes.
see it. And I want to go back to what you were saying about that when you're not able to experience good and bad emotions, like you miss out also on like the best emotions that you can experience or the best experiences that you have because you don't know how to navigate that. Um, can you, what are the emotions that you feel like most people know? And what are the emotions that like you want to get to the place where you're aware of what that looks like within our body and like how we experience them?
The emotion that comes up immediately, I think, is shame. I think that that's one that as humans, we just stay as far away as possible from.
Mm.
But I think that it's often at the root of a lot of, especially childhood issues. And so I think the more comfortable that we can get with knowing what it feels like to experience shame and knowing when it comes up, the more that we can navigate it. Because I think although our nature is kind of just push it away because it doesn't feel good, the more that we can sit with it, the more that we can understand what we need when it comes up.
Mm. What does shame look like or mean to you personally?
I think it's the essence of not being enough. So for whatever reason that you are not worthy enough, you are not smart enough, pretty enough, capable enough, whatever that would be, in order to have other people connect with you and love you in a way that you need. And so I think that that can show up in multiple different ways. It can show up in, you know, when we had talked about people not necessarily accepting or not experiencing relationships that are reciprocal, it can be a situation where shame is what's causing them to feel like they can't accept reciprocation.
Mm.
So sometimes it's not necessarily always people taking advantage of us. It's sometimes that we have a hard time accepting people's love and affection, and shame can really get in the way of that. So I think that that's definitely what I've seen it look like in my own journey and in clients' journeys as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I resonate with that one. It's like I feel like I give a lot, but sometimes it's like when people are like give me compliment, even like as small as a compliment. And I remember I was like, oh my God, like I get so uncomfortable with that. I'm like, no, like let me do that for you. But like taking it is so hard. But
Mm-hmm.
then like the underlying root of that is the belief of like I have to change to be loved, or I'm not loved as I am,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So I completely like, yes, that I think hits home for a lot of people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and how can that narrative shift? Is that like literally within ourselves through the way that we talk to ourselves, or like the like how can we start changing that or working through that?
I think there's multiple ways. I think definitely the way that we talk to ourselves really matters. I think the environments we put ourselves in, the relationships that we allow ourselves to be in, um, the way that in which we take care of ourselves or don't take care of ourselves. So I think it's really holistic in that sense, because I think the more that you start to sit with shame and really understand okay, what do I need? Um, what I need is to be loved and appreciated for who I am, and um, from myself and also from other people. And so if I love and appreciate myself for who I am, that means that I'm going to take care of myself. How do I take care of myself? That might look like making sure that you're sleeping well, making sure that you're, drinking water, making sure that you're getting physical activity, making sure that you're challenging yourself, um, making sure that the relationships that you have are relationships that are nurturing to you and not, damaging for you. And in that, there can be a lot of loss, which is really difficult. So I think that, when we go back to that conversation around, oh, it's really hard to start this journey, I think that there can be a lot of anticipatory grief around it, because when we do start that journey, a lot of times what we find is that there's people in our lives or environments that we kind of frequent that don't mesh with us anymore or won't mesh with us. So it
Mm-hmm.
can be really hard to give those up.
Yeah. I call that the growing pains because it's really it's
Mm-hmm.
like a part of you is like grieving and seeing like who I was and maybe that person connected or that environment to a version of you that was not, that was more in the trauma, always hyper vigilant, always, and but then like
Mm-hmm.
when you become aware of it, it's like it's so hard. And I feel like people don't talk so much about like the process of healing because like it's
Hmm.
not as pretty as people put it, like the glow ups,
Hmm.
like you're just, living, like traveling, doing all these things. Like I'm like, I cry even on those vacations.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
I have had those moments where it just comes up again, or like something like happens that reminds me, and I'm like, wow, like I was so different a year ago or 2 years ago, or like this
Yeah.
person's not in my life. How have you seen
Yeah.
that in your life or experienced that?
Um, 100% agree. It's not, I think social media definitely romanticizes the healing journey a lot. And so I think that can sometimes deter people when they start of like, ooh, is it supposed to feel this
Mm-hmm.
like this? Like it hurts, it sucks. I don't like feeling these things.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the reality of it, is that there are days where you are just crying, where you are just grieving, where you are really happy and excited and all of everything in between. And so I think that it can be really difficult to sit with um, the decisions that maybe you have made, the decisions that you need to make, the grief of lost relationships, the grief of, loss of your sense of self, the grief of certain parts of your childhood. And so it is really difficult. There are days where you are just crying, and that is just it. And that's also okay though.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, I feel like that was like my body being like, let's just get it out. Let's just like, it's like what
Yeah.
you needed sometimes,
Yeah.
like, and our body kind of knows. And so aware of my emotions, I would say, like, I do cry, like, and I'm very open to it. Like, I'm like, it is what it
Oh,
is.
me too.
Like, I have my best friend. She's like the total opposite. She's like I can be telling her something, and then she's like, like she processes so different. I'm like, I don't know how to be like that. Um,
One thing about me is I'm gonna cry.
is I'm a cry. I love that. So no judgment here, okay?
Yeah.
And then also when people are telling me their own stories, like I feel it. Like I'm like, ooh, like I just have a lot of empathy for, people that have experienced, and then especially if I've experienced that, I definitely feel like, it just gives you a lot of compassion for people. And that's the way that it
Hmm.
shows. But I know that some people are scared of those tears and are scared of like that
Hmm.
process to get there.
Hmm.
So maybe it's the other extreme. So what about for someone that isn't that in touch or in tune, kind of like numbed out when it comes to like
Hmm.
how do you start that for that person?
I think that, in my work, I've always started with really gradually being aware of what's happening in your body. And so it also really depends on kind of the client's history and whatnot. But I think it can be really helpful to just start by being aware of like, okay, what is it? Do I recognize when I'm hungry or thirsty or have to go to the bathroom? Do I actually recognize these cues, or am I just kind of on autopilot? And
Mm-hmm.
so when you're able to start tolerating those, more so, I would say basic things, because they're things that, you feel every single day in order to survive, then it can be easier to start to get to know the different sensations that come with like maybe feeling sad or anxious or scared or happy and excited. And so I think just kind of slowly introducing yourself to some of those, that just body awareness can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. You were talking a little bit earlier about like when you don't feel enough. Usually for myself, when I don't feel enough, I actually do more to try to prove or like to try to do,
Hmm.
which that causes
Hmm.
causes a lot of other things within my body and the way that I feel stressed and can lead to burnout, all of that. And I feel like as women, sometimes we do want to like prove our worth. It can
Hmm.
be in the career space, relationship space, kind of like, so navigating that, like, how do you see the effects of what stress and that can do to your body? Like, we talked about that being internally, right? But then our actions and like how that shows up in our body, like, how can those things affect us?
Mm. And what you're talking about is how can, doing those actions like overexerting yourself affect us?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it kind of exacerbates that feeling, even though the intention is to say like, okay, I am enough. Look, I can do all these things, or I'm doing all these things for you, or I'm doing all these things to prove myself. But I think it just exacerbates that feeling, because then it's like, okay, we need to do all of these things in order to prove that we are worthy. And so then that just reinforces, even if we do get that positive, affirmation or reinforcement, then it just proves that, oh, I needed to do these things. And so sometimes, what can be helpful is taking a step back, even though it might feel counterintuitive in the moment, of like, I have people who love and care about me. And if it doesn't feel that way, then perhaps that's an invitation to reevaluate a lot of your relationships as well.
A hustle culture mentality.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Mm-hmm.
know that those things do affect us, like our
Oh,
body,
absolutely.
that's that
Yeah.
all of those things that affect our body. Like, yes, you can be an amazing, powerful, strong, independent woman, but when you show up in places like, and you're able to do that, and people see that part of you externally, but like internally, those things can be harming us. And so
Mm.
what do those things look like that maybe someone's like, well, what are the signs that maybe I'm burning out, or I feel overwhelmed or
Mm.
stressed within my body?
Yeah. I think emotional exhaustion is one of them. So if you feel like your cup is empty, you don't really have much to give to anybody else, you find that maybe resentment is growing in your relationship. Um, I think in terms of kind of like physical signs and symptoms, that could look like kind of tension building up in your body. Often that happens a lot within like your shoulders or your back. Um, Difficulties sleeping, difficulties eating, whether you're under eating or overeating. Um, yeah, I think those would probably be the main ones, especially even noticing kind of some of those hyperarousal or hypoarousal symptoms. So, like maybe your heart is beating really fast consistently. Maybe you're feeling really anxious. Maybe you are, doing your strong, independent woman thing, but then you're after work, you're noticing that you're really overspending, or you're starting to use substances a lot more than usual. Or you're noticing you're having, suicidal ideation or self-harming tendencies. So I think that if you're doing the strong independent woman or a strong independent person thing, and it feels good in your life as well, you'll notice by your habits too. So if it's impacting you emotionally, you'll notice it start to infiltrate kind of different parts of your life. Either you will feel great about doing kind of the things of daily living, like feeling like you can take care of yourself, feeling like you can show up for other people and have other people show up for you, feeling like you can take care of things at home and whatnot. But if not, then it's something to take a look at.
Because then all those like daily things seem so overwhelming, because you're like, I
Mm-hmm.
have all these things to do on my list, so it's not even as rewarding. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like when you're not, that's how I have experienced it. It's like, it's not rewarding, it's not worth it too, because you're like, yeah, this is great here, but like in other areas of my life I'm not. And that's usually where
Mm-hmm.
either like a boundary or something needs to be established
Mm-hmm.
to have that, like to be able to enjoy like the things that you do have.
Absolutely. If you're kind of crawling and inching to that finish line, and by the time you get to that finish line, you're just dead exhausted and, can barely function, then it doesn't feel as great as if you walked or ran to that finish line because you had the resources on all ends.
Mm-hmm. What are practical tips that someone can take, that they, if maybe they, you shared about the ways that they can regulate or learn and be aware, but what are
Mm-hmm.
some tips on kind of starting from the inside out, like internally, things that they can do or things that they can think about to start practicing to build that habit of like, okay, being aware of my body, being aware of what I need.
Mm-hmm. So I would say like build a check-in for yourself, whether that's, once a day at a time that you decide, check in with your body, say, is there something that I need right now? And you can assess, you can maybe just start with the physical needs of like, am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Do I need to go to the bathroom? Does my, body feel tense? Do I need to go for a walk or something? Start from there. And then you can also build up to emotionally? How do I feel emotionally right now? Do I feel, lonely or isolated? Do I feel like I need some support or some connection? Do I feel sad or anxious or happy or excited?
Mhm. Those are good. Those are good. It's
Yeah.
like knowing like what brings us joy again. I feel like that is
Hmm.
also good. Like being like, what do I enjoy? Because like what we talked about, even with trauma,
Hmm.
I feel like when you've experienced kind of like the way that you see the world, you lose the whole hope part of like things will be better. I can
Hmm.
have better relationships. I can enjoy things. Like I have experienced times of being numbed
Hmm.
out where you like literally like just have no way to connect or feel
Hmm.
anything. Um,
Hmm.
so starting with for me it was like movement, like figuring out like
Yeah.
what felt good. Nature was so healing for me,
Hmm.
like being outdoors. I never was
Hmm.
able to see, like after now I see like how that helped me throughout my healing journey, like just being outside,
Hmm.
sunsets, and
Hmm.
I was like, wow, this is so nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think too, when you're able to be more in touch with your body, the more that you're able to really figure out what you even like and dislike. Because I think I've worked with a lot of people who are just like, I have no idea. Like, how do I know what I like and dislike? And that comes with, the sensations that come in your body. So whether you gravitate towards or away from something, your body will tell you. If I were to ask, I've asked clients before when that question comes up, do you want a hug right now? And they'll either say yes or no. And I'm like, you knew in your body whether that was like, ooh, no, I don't really want a hug, or yeah, I do want a hug. And
Mm.
so that's an example of your body kind of can tell you what is something that you're drawn to or something that you're not drawn to. And similar to what you're talking about, when you notice like nature is healing for you, just being outside, your body tells you, like, oh, this is something that I enjoy. This is something that makes me feel good.
Mm-hmm. And it's so hard for people that have I mean, in many areas, like it's like that they've never had to think about themselves. It was always about others to kind of go
Mm-hmm.
inward. Because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
but like, why? Like, why should I have to care about this? Like, like I'm just kind of like what I'm giving to the world and all of that, which goes back to the way that we see ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm really passionate about like encouraging women to see how like yes it's great to have these goals and all these things that we're all striving for things that we want,
Mm-hmm.
but making sure that you're okay on the inside, that like at night
Mm-hmm.
when you're processing things in the relationships that you're in, like
Mm-hmm.
you feel like you have joy, you have peace, and that is like the best win. I would say that like how you were saying earlier that like when you look back at like the part of you that thought that was like okay being not dealing with your trauma,
Mm-hmm.
it's so rewarding to see like wow, I can experience life in such a full way now versus
Mm-hmm.
not.
Just on the surface.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, I love what you shared today. And I know that people are going to relate to what you've shared. Is there anything that you would like to end off as an encouragement or share with someone that has either been through trauma, navigating their inner work, or starting, that you would like to leave with us?
I think the thing that comes to mind is just go slow and steady. I think that there's no rush, even if society, social media, whatever it is that, makes us feel like there's this rush to be quote unquote healed and do all of these things. There is no rush, and you're kind of always at your own pace. And healing is kind of like a journey, a lifelong journey of, you're learning and unlearning things as you grow older. So even though there's a lot of parts of maybe your healing journey that you feel like, okay, I've accomplished this. As you grow older, there's going to be things that you want to unlearn and then you want to learn. And that's just kind of the cycle of life. And I think that it's really important to be gentle with yourself and know that you can take small steps or large steps depending on how you feel. And
Mhm.
both are okay.
That's good. I love that. And I love this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing the knowledge and the wisdom that you have. And where can people
Yeah.
connect with you and all that, all the practical tips that you share?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is the Cognitive Corner on pretty much every social platform. And I also really thank you for inviting me on here. It definitely was a great conversation.
I hope you got something out of today's episode. It was a very educational, informative, and just seeing how practically you can use those tools in your life to start, if you haven't already started digging into the work internally, but also like how she said, like take it slow and just understanding that we all are a work in progress. But if you enjoyed the conversation, make sure to share it with a friend and make sure to subscribe to this podcast, leave a review if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next week.